Hello, everyone, and welcome to Cataloging 101. This is going to be part one, and there will be a part two as well. I thought I'd let you see me and I'd say hi, and then I'm going to turn off my video because I find it a little distracting, but I like to kind of see who the person is. So welcome, everyone. And like I said, I'm going to turn off my camera and we're just going to dive right into this topic. So today we're really going to be focused on what is cataloging. And there I am from an event a few years ago as Clinda. So our theme will be the Wizard of Oz and the adventure that you are undertaking. So we're going to talk a little bit about cataloging at that higher level, kind of what's the purpose of it. Then we're going to dive a little bit into what I call the alphabet soup of cataloging. So we're going to talk through some of that terminology. I promise I will keep it brief. We are not going to really dig into the terminology too much, but I will kind of scatter terminology throughout today's session. Then we're going to really focus on MARC basics because that's an important piece of this in terms of understanding what you're looking at and also why you're looking at it. So we're going to talk about those two things. Then we're going to really talk about what is it? What is this thing that you're looking at? Sometimes it's very easy, and we're going to talk about the easy things, but we're going to talk about the more challenging things, and we're really going to dive into this next week because this is where, it's when you get the easy thing that comes across your desk, hey, that's great, right? You do it, you're done, out the door, or onto marking, or onto the shelf, or onto the patron waiting for it, or wherever it may be going. It's those challenging things that is really where we hit those stumping points. So we're gonna talk a lot about what is it today, but we're going to talk much more about it next time. We're going to finally, just very briefly, talk about what is a match and is it a match, but we're really going to focus on that next time. So next time we're actually going to go through the process. We're going to look at all the MARC fields in terms of whether or not something's a match, and we're going to go through that whole process. So, and lots of tips and problem solving for next time. Today's to set the foundation, and for those of you who have been doing some cataloging already, I'm hoping that there's some new information you'll glean, or maybe some new ways of thinking about what you're doing, or if you need to communicate what you do to other staff members or your library director or your library dean or board or whoever it may be, then I'm hoping that maybe you'll have some new ideas in terms of how to communicate the purpose of what we do in terms of cataloging. Finally, there will be resources, and there's some online exercises, kind of knowledge check quiz kind of thing. You're going to have access to all of that after today's session. I am a resource curator. I am a resource collector. I have been training for, I'm not going to say how long I've been training. It's been a long time. So as I have worked on things and as I have found things, I do, collect them up for use, and I create my own stuff too. So everything today is my own stuff. So, what is cataloging? What is the heart of what we do? Well, it really is about analyzing that work that we have purchased or that's been donated to us, or maybe we subscribe to it, however we get those materials. And in looking at those materials, one of the things we have to make that first decision on, of course, is what is it? And we're going to talk more about what is it in just a few minutes. But, we have to decide, is it a book? Is it a DVD? Format makes it easy for some materials, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But there are other times when you're looking at formats, or you're looking at things that look the same, but maybe they're different. And so we're going to be talking more about that as we go along today. The other piece of it is we're looking at the information that's provided about the resource. And this could be on the resource itself, our book jackets, our title pages, all of that kind of stuff. It could be things that come along with the resource, the box set for the DVD, the invoice that comes along with it, with the information from the publisher. It could be all of those different things. So we're going to talk more about that, and we're going to talk a lot more about that again next week. We're really just sort of hitting the high points today. And then, of course, the other piece of it is, what's the subject of this work? What is this work about? And we're going to talk more about this in just a second too, because really our goal is how can we best describe this resource so our users can find this resource? I mean, that's the heart of what we do. And so anyone who says to you, oh, you don't work in public services, or public services, cataloging is not a public service, that is a complete, now you may not be in the department called public services, but the work that you do is public services. The data that we create is the foundation for everything that our patrons access. If we don't get it right, our patrons are not going to find it. If we don't get, a record in the catalog, our patrons are not going to find it. So we are critical in terms of what our patrons are doing in the library and in terms of accessing our resources. So we do have a really critical role, and the library is much more of a sort of holistic ecosystem than I think sometimes people think about. It's like, well, here's public services or reference, here's cataloging, here's tech services. Things are all very, sort of very separated. And that may be true in terms of administration, but in terms of the work that happens, those things are very much interconnected together. So can our users find what they want and need using our data? Our data is how we talk to our patrons. Now, certainly, if you're working on the reference desk, or if you're answering the telephones or taking ILL requests or teaching a workshop or a BI session or whatever it may be, you're having that direct interaction with patrons. But if you are, cataloging, if you are ordering materials, if you are working with this data, in the course of working with that data is the language that we are talking to our patrons directly. And of course, they don't know it, right? They're just looking at, they're just seeing a search box and typing in what they're looking for, right? And sometimes they don't even quite know what they're looking for. But we are really, trying to center the work that we do in how can we meet the needs of our users better? Can our users find what they're looking for? Can they identify it? So, and some of these things we will talk about briefly here. You may think, well, gosh, just getting patrons in the door, or just getting them to talk to us, or just getting them to, understand a little bit about library resources is a big leap. And that's certainly true. We have kind of many of our users, and certainly we have all become accustomed to just Googling it, right? You type in something in Google and you get a result back. We often don't think very critically about that resource. Now, maybe a student doing a paper would, or a faculty member doing research would, but for the most part, we Google something, we get a result back, and we maybe go look at it and think, oh, that wasn't it. Or we go look at something else and maybe it's a good enough answer. We get something from Wikipedia and it's like, well, that was a good enough answer. So in some ways, the fact that we do have the ability to go out and use the internet and sort of, or ask Alexa, or ask your other smart device, it will just give us an answer. It does try to give us the best answer it can, but that's not always going to be the best answer, because it has a lot to do with those companies, right? We get ads shown up to us first. Sometimes things that are maybe more commercial get shown to us before, say, a government or academic website. So, how they relevance rank and what they choose to serve to us is not always based upon our best interest. And it's certainly not based upon necessarily whether or not that is exactly the best resource for us for that particular search term. There's a lot of factors that go into that, including, those paid results that we all are so accustomed to seeing. So, in some ways, that experience, you Google something, you get an answer, we just kind of accept the sort of the quality of that answer without really thinking too much about it. Libraries, on the other hand, and especially for our data, we have really tried to make data and use data in a way so that people can find what they're looking for based upon the terms that they're looking for. And we do have some challenges with that. Sometimes our systems are outdated. And if our systems are outdated, then that's not going to provide sort of that user experience, kind of that Googleable experience that we're all so used to. And so that may itself be a barrier to our users. So there's a lot of barriers to our data and our patrons' ability to be able to use that data besides the data itself. Certainly the data itself can be a barrier too. But we at least have, unlike the companies of the world that, have these search engines and social media sites and all this kind of stuff and all the apps and stuff. I mean, we are not making money off of our users in that way. We are not trying to sell them a product. We are truly trying to meet their needs. And so several years ago, and we're going to talk a little bit about this more as we kind of dive into terminology, but several years ago, we decided as a community that we really wanted to kind of talk about, why we do cataloging, what the purpose of it is. And we really centered it very much in trying to meet the needs of our users. I mean, of course we did, right? Why would we not? That's, an important piece of this. And so we came up with this list of tasks that is the called the Ferber user task. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in just a minute. But the user tasks are basically, can our users find what they are looking for? The other piece of it more recently we've added is this last one, explore. So can they find other related things? So, when you go into a library or you go into a bookstore, or maybe you go in Target or wherever you may go in, and you just kind of maybe wander around a little bit, or you see something and you think like, oh, I'm going to go look over there. That serendipity of discovery, seeing things that may be near each other, organized in a way that there's a relationship between them. Although we may not, if you're in Target, sometimes it feels like, why did they organize things this way? They have their methods, but what is the relationship of that to be able to explore other things? Of course, when you're talking about a store, they're trying to sell you other things. We're looking at our data, we're trying to help people find other related things. So that last one is a little bit of a new one because we have been sort of thinking beyond how can people just find what they're looking for. And these are called the Ferber user task. So it has a big, long, fancy word, Ferber user task, Ferber, and we're going to talk about Ferber in just a minute. Functional requirements for bibliographic records. So that's what Ferber means. It's a lot of verbiage and discussion and data models and all this kind of stuff. But one of the key parts of it is actually defining and saying this is the purpose of the work that we do. So our users can find what they're looking for and find those related things. So when people say technical services, cataloging is not a public service, that sure looks like public service to me, doesn't it? So yes, we are part of this process. So, okay, so we're grounded in meeting the needs of our users. So what do we look for when we are describing an item that we get? So when we get something new, what are we looking for? Well, cataloging sort of has two parts to it. And we're going to talk more about this as we really start digging into the MARC part of it and talking through it. But it is recording. And by recording, I mean inputting information. I don't mean like video recording or audio recording, but actually inputting information, typing information, and then providing context. So recording information is about taking the resource itself and describing it. How many inches is that resource? How many pages does that resource have? What is the title of that resource? That kind of stuff. Providing context is where we do things to help our users. What is this particular work about? We're going to give it a subject so that people can find it. Because if you just try to search for something by title, you're not going to find everything you need, and you're going to find a bunch of stuff you don't want. Now, sometimes if you know exactly what you want, I'm reading I'm reading Wizard or Return to Oz. I'm going to read the next in the series, Return to Oz. I know exactly what I want. Then searching by title in that case, would work. I would see all the different variations that a library might have of Return to Oz. But if I were searching for, say, fantasy novels for children, or if I were searching for books about wizards or something else like that. I have a kid who has really gotten on reading books about wizards, and I'm kind of looking around to see what other kinds of books that we could read. And The Wizard of Oz, of course, has a wizard in it. So in that case, maybe since the title has wizard in it, at least for The Wizard of Oz, I would find that one, but I would not necessarily find Return to Oz, although that one also has a wizard in it. So, part of what we do is record the information about the resource itself. So we have an accurate representation of what we actually own, but then we also provide context, and we provide context through adding subjects. We sometimes add additional notes to kind of explain more about the resource. We provide a summary. This book is about the great and powerful Oz and the adventure that Dorothy undertakes, or whatever we may write about it. We give a summary of that resource. And then we also, as part of providing context for that resource, we also will, if it's a print resource or an analog resource, we want to be able to put it on the shelf so that our users can find it. So we'll then assign a call number to go with it. So creating a record is those two pieces. It's recording, creating an accurate representation of that resource itself, and then providing additional contextual information about it so that our users can find what they're looking for, because the two pieces need to work together. And that is an important piece of it. So what are we looking for? Well, for the title, we're looking from the information from the item itself. So we are looking for how the item represents itself, or how the resource represents itself. Now, if you have a book, this is easy. They usually have a title page, right? You pick up the book, you flip it open, and right at the beginning is a page that tells you the title and maybe the author and the date it was published and some other wonderful information. Those are easier. How you may have, but not always easy. Because sometimes you have conflicting information, right? You might have the book jacket has one title on it, and then maybe when you open the book, it has a little slightly different title. And we'll talk about those situations in part 2 coming up. But we are looking at how the item represents itself. For a book-like item, that's typically going to be a title page. That's going to be sort of at the beginning. There are times when we are working with materials that do not have a title page. It may be like in my situation where I was working with special collections material. Of course, some of that's not going to have title pages. You have collections of letters, collections of photographs, things like that. Those things don't have title pages. They're not published like a book. You may also have things, as I have done, where you have things that are missing the beginning of the book, and you kind of have to come up with something. So there are times as a cataloger, regardless, what kind of library you're working in, depending on the type of resource you're working with, you may be constructing or creating a title more than you are being able to look at the resource and kind of pull together that title. There are also, if we're scanning or digitizing resources, if it is a book-like thing, then the title may be created in the process of the OCR. And OCR is the optical character recognition. You don't really need to know that for anything cataloging related, but that's what creates the full text piece of a PDF, and that can also be a way sometimes to create a record too. So, that piece of it is one of the first, I wouldn't say the first piece, but it is one of the pieces that we look at when we're cataloging. What is the title? Media has a lot of different pieces to it, but typically for media, again, you're looking at how the item represents itself. Again, we'll talk more about the details of how you make those decisions in the part 2 coming up. We also are describing the format and the extent of it. So how, what the dimensions of that resource are, how big that resource is, how many pages, if it's a paged volume, how many pages it has, if it's a sheet or like a photograph, if it's a print or analog object. We are describing the dimension components of it. We also describe what the file format is. Now, you may think, like, why do we care what the size of a book is? Well, if you're shelving something and you have a book that's 35 centimeters and your shelving is only 32 centimeters tall, then you're going to have to figure out how to handle those. It may be that you put all of those oversized books. If you have really, really big, giant, oversized books, then you may put those in a special section in your library so that they're able to be either laid flat to reduce the strain on the book bindings, or you may actually just, increase the shelving space so that you can shelve them vertically. So the dimensions of a resource in terms of, how wide it is and things like that are less relevant probably to the public, although some public users probably would look at it and go, oh, I'm looking for a big book. If it says 64 centimeters, I'm looking for a big book or a bigger book. For shelving purposes, it's important to us. For identifying the resource and knowing that we have a matching resource, it is important. In terms of pagination, how many pages does something have? That is useful. And I'll have to admit, as an undergraduate student, I'm going to out myself here. When I would be doing research and I would see a book that was like 500 pages, if it were not like a collection of essays or a compilation or something, I would just think, oh, do I really want to go get that book that's 500 pages and have to read 500 pages to write this paper? I need 10 resources. I mean, that would be 50,000 pages if every one of those, resources, if every one of those, or 5,000 pages. But anyway, it would be a whole lot of pages to dig through if every one of those resources had 500 pages. So, I'll have to admit, as a public user, as a, newbie college student, I did look at the pages and sort of prioritize that a little bit. Like, yeah, is that really the resource I need? Can I find one that's not 500 pages? And sometimes you have to get the book that's 500 pages. The other things we also tell in the description is we also talk about illustrations. And, if it's a digital file, we will talk about the file size too. Now, for the digital files especially, although, it's not necessarily relevant, even if you have an electronic book, is it relevant to know how many pages it is? It might be, in terms of if you have your reader and you're kind of trying to decide, like, is this a quick read? Could I read it on the airplane? Can I read it on vacation? Or is this, this is War and Peace and I'm going to spend some time with it? We do make those kind of decisions. We make those decisions when we're looking at our own reading material. So things like how many pages something is, how big the file is, especially with how big the file is. If it is a very large file and you're trying to download it to your phone, do you really have enough memory on your phone to be able to do that? So even though some of these things we may look at and think, why do we include that information? When we start looking at how our users actually interact with this information, these are important things for them to know. And they're important for us to know, especially, like I said, in shelving and some other situations. The other thing, of course, and this may be more for us than our users, especially these days. And we'll talk a little bit more about what these days means. But what type of item is it? Is it a book? Is it a magazine? Is it a database? Is it a photograph? Things like that. I think this is a very interesting conversation because we have really defined our formats and types of materials very granularly in some ways, and then in other areas, not so much. So for an ebook, there's sort of an ebook. We haven't actually defined to the level of, is this a Kindle book? Is this a net library book? Whatever platform it may need. And so I do kind of wonder if we're going to continue to define our formats in the same way, because I could see that changing in the future as we continue down this road of more digital content, more file formats, more different platforms. As I mentioned earlier, we do include a summary of what the work is about. Now, this has not been something that has been included in all records, and certainly not included in all records throughout the history of cataloging. This is one of these areas where also public libraries and academic libraries would deviate sometimes in practice. It just really kind of depended upon the library and their catalogers in terms of whether or not a summary was included. So when I started working in one academic institution as a young cataloger, we did not include summaries for works of literature. We were an academic institution that was not considered to be a priority at that time. Of course, at that time, every publisher didn't send along or provide a summary of that work. So we would have actually had to construct one to come up with a summary to put into those records. And so it was seen as a lot of work for not much reward for our particular library. Public library summaries were very important sort of from the beginning, because that's how you tell users about, what the book's about besides the subject. So, there have been times where we've deviated from practice within library communities, within cataloging, but we've also deviated from practice even within, sort of how much work you did. And different libraries change throughout time depending upon what the needs of their particular community was, and then also what the vision of cataloging was in that particular library. Because we can't do probably as much cataloging and technical services work as we would all like to. Even if you're working in a large institution and you are a cataloger and you do no other work besides cataloging, I guarantee you that there are records and materials in your collections that need to be cataloged, that need to be reviewed, that need to be recatalogued, that need some additional work done to them. It's just the nature of the fact that information is an evolving profession. And so even if something was cataloged 25 years ago, and it may be that, well, the data is still, the data is still quality data, but it just doesn't meet modern standards. You might leave it, or it may be something that you kind of put on a list to review. So, there's always work to be done, and it's a matter of how much work can we really do. And we'll talk more about this as we're talking about copy cataloging, especially, and sort of what your options are and how realistic that workload is. If multiple items are represented in one work, then that, multiple volumes, things like that, you may include a table of contents, or you might include a list of parts. That can also be chapters within a book. So we see that a lot more than sort of the early days of cataloging, things like that. And then finally, we will add those notes about an item itself to kind of give a little bit more information. Subjects, not just keywords. So this is a really big difference between what we do and how we provide value beyond Google. We actually use a defined list of subjects. Now there's There's pros and cons to that, and I could talk all day about them. But the fact that we use a defined list of subjects that are part of a hierarchy means that we do have the data infrastructure to help our users find related terms. If you are searching for dogs, but you really you're really looking for a specific type of dog, then we have the ability to have more of a hierarchy and to be able to help people get to those things. Typically, how we do that work is even, when we're just even if you're just doing the work from scratch, so you're starting with nothing, you're picking the most appropriate subject off of a list. So the Library of Congress subject headings, Sears subject headings, Dewey subject headings, they're a gigantic, and it is gigantic, multi-level layer list. This list is what's called a controlled vocabulary. We're going to talk a little bit more about controlled vocabularies later as we talk about Library of Congress subject headings briefly. We can't go too much into controlled vocabularies, but I did want to kind of connect the terminology of controlled vocabulary to what we're talking about. Because if you start talking to others, or you start, kind of maybe reading more about subjects and keywords and things like that, you're going to see the term controlled vocabulary come up. And a controlled vocabulary is a defined list of topics for a particular use. It could be anything. You can make your own controlled vocabulary. If you are organizing your own personal library at home, you could have your own controlled vocabulary however you want it to be. It could be subjects. It could be, I don't know that color is particularly helpful. It could be whatever you want it to be. But the controlled vocabulary is to pick off the list and only use the terms that are on that list. It doesn't have to have a hierarchy like Library of Congress does, but it can. So you could define things even more. You do see controlled vocabularies used in some web interfaces. Sometimes they call these a taxonomy. The taxonomy is the relationship or the hierarchy. The controlled vocabulary piece of it, controlled. What does the word control mean? It means you must choose. You can only do these things. We are controlling your choices. Now, controlling choices sounds like that's a bad thing. But in terms of controlling choices from data standpoint, it's a really good thing because it leads people to the terms. Now, the downside of a controlled vocabulary, like the Library of Congress subject headings, is sometimes our terms get outdated because it is so hard for us all to update our records. And that is one of the reasons why it takes so long to get Library of Congress subject headings updated. It's also a process. So there's like a whole committee that has to look at these, because the impact of changing one subject heading in the Library of Congress subject headings means that every single library that has any data that uses that subject heading, they're going to have to update their records. Now you may say, do they have to update their records? Well, if they don't, then they're still going to have an outdated version in the catalog, and kind of the rest of the cataloging community's moved on. And this is how we get, local libraries that have outdated subject headings. Now we have been trying to tackle this for a while, and I do feel like we're making movement on it, but it is one of the reasons why. There's other reasons. There's also political reasons, because what's the Library of Congress? It is the library of who? Congress. So it's not the library of libraries. It's not something that we all have a say in. It's the Library of Congress. So because of that, there's also this whole political thing that comes up. I mean, it's a very complex thing, but part of the reason why it takes so long to update those headings is the impact of those heading changes. They also don't add headings until there is a documented request. So this committee doesn't just go out to look to see what new emerging terms exist. What are people talking about out in the social media, or what new words are being put in the dictionary. There's none of that. The terms come to them along with evidence I'm cataloging this book on emerging technologies, the nanoverse, or whatever it may be, and I want to use this term. This is the term that is being used in the community, and this is the term I want to use. So you have to propose that as a cataloger, and then it goes through a whole process. Because there is not only the process to add it to that controlled vocabulary, but also then the impact of making those changes. Now, as I said, we are working on figuring out a way to make that change process easier. And there are more batch tools for libraries to use and things like that. So it's a little bit easier than it used to be when we had to type card catalogs. And yes, when a subject heading changed, when you had one of those little card catalogs, you were supposed to, as a library, go pull all of those books that had that subject heading, and you marked out, or you took your white out, that liquid stuff, and you would cover up the subject heading, and then you would retype that. Yes, you would retype it. So our legacy processes really impact sometimes what we do too, and sort of the slowness that it takes to do things. The other thing that we do when we're cataloging, and this is really the part of it that gets to the MARC piece of it, is that we then take all of this information we've just talked about there, and we kind of wrap it in specific coding to assist the library catalogs and our systems so that our users can find these materials. So you can actually catalog without ever creating a MARC record. But if you're going to put it into your ILS, if you're going to put it into your system, it's going to have to probably be in a MARC record. So, you could sit down with a piece of paper and you could go through and all the things we've talked about, and you could catalog just on a piece of paper. What's the title? What's the author? All that stuff, and come up with a catalog record that has no MARC formatting. But if you then wanted to sit down and type that into a system, it's going to have that MARC formatting around it. The end goal is always for our users to find what they're looking for. That's why we do what we do. So we've already talked a little bit about these. I want to kind of define these very clearly in terms of the 3 types of processes that happen with cataloging, because there's the describing piece of it, and that's description. And this is where we are making sure we're creating an accurate record of what a library holds. Sometimes you'll hear holdings or holds. That just means owns. And that is a recording or documenting of that information. Recording as in inputting. The subject analysis piece of it, this is where we're really getting to the context piece of it. This is about analyzing the content of the resource to determine its subject. And we'll talk a little bit more about how this differs between copy and original cataloging in just a second. The final piece of it is determining the call number. And this is how you organize and arrange the resource, how you're going to classify it in your collection. And basically it's where it's going to be shelved if it's a print or physical resource. So this will be like the call number. It might be the collection. If you have more than one library, it might be the branch or the library it's going to, the location and where in which it resides. Now, if you're working with digital content, you may or may not be doing this. Sometimes people like to have this information in digital content because it is connected to the subject, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. But other times, if it's a digital content, you don't really need a call number for it, right? You just need the link to be able to get to that thing. So, this is a place where libraries, for electronic resources, for digital content, this is a place where libraries do make different decisions based upon what their thoughts are in terms of how relevant that information is. Certainly for physical resources, we want people to be able to go to the shelf themselves or with someone helping them and get that resource. Digital content, we want them to be able to click on that resource or to be able to access that resource digitally. So How do we do this? So we talked a little bit already. We've touched on MARC just a tiny bit. We're really going to dive into it in just a minute. We create records in a database, and these databases are typically now called an ILS. And an ILS stands for Integrated Library System. And what an ILS does is it combines everything. So we've already talked about this some, but it's that inventory process. What does the library hold? What does the library own? An accurate representation of what your particular library actually has access to or has on the shelves. Now, we also, of course, for inventory purposes, a lot of times we keep the records for things that we have discarded or withdrawn. So we may hide those from the public view. We don't want people to see them. We don't want people to be asking for things that, got ate by the dog and is never coming back. But at the same time, we may want an accurate, for our purposes, for the staff purposes, we may want to have an accurate documentation of that, either for auditing purposes to show that, yes, we bought this book and, dog ate it, it's not coming back, out of print, we're not going to buy another one. But, we may want to document all of that for a variety of purposes, including inventory, circulation status, and accounting purposes. The other thing that we use, so that's for those of you who work some in the public services, you're probably much more aware of like circulation statistics and what materials are circulating more and all of that kind of stuff. But that is using, at least connected the user to that record that we've created. The other piece of it is that the record is used by the search engines, and Google cannot really work with MARC records without some intermediary. So MARC's a whole different conversation, but we do have our own search engines that we use that are developed to work with MARC records. And typically this would be the ILS. This would be the public interface of the ILS. The back end of the ILS would be more where we would see the inventory, circulation, accounting purposes, and that's where we typically are doing our data work as well. This record, so the record is used partially for inventory because it's connected to the patron and what the patron is doing. So it's all, when I said we were all one giant, ecosystem, that's part of how we fit into this. Our record is used for multiple things. So it's used for inventory, connected to the patron. And then it's also what we probably think of more directly is it's used in terms of that search so that our users can find what they need. Now, once they find it, what are they going to do? If that's the book they want, they're going to go check it out. And so that then ties them to the data that we've just created. So, we create these records, or we create them by downloading a copy from elsewhere. And we will talk much more about the sort of separation between creating a new record and that copy of a record. The other place that we create records, and there may be some of you who are working in a digital archive, you might be working for a digital humanities program or project or local history project. Maybe you're working in an institutional repository project. That is the same process. There may or may not be the inventory aspect of it because that content's usually digital. So it's more about access and how many times a resource has been accessed, but it's the same thing. We are creating data for the repository and digital archives side of the house. It's in a specific format for that particular system. The kind of good thing about MARC is because so many libraries use it in terms of creating records for our library resources in our ILS systems, that although we do have some system nuances, each system does things just a tiny bit differently, and it might read the MARC record just a little bit differently, but a MARC record is a MARC record is a MARC record. So we have much more standardization and consistency in dealing with the ILS records because they are all MARC, and MARC has very specific requirements. In these digital archives or repository systems, although you are creating a catalog metadata record, you are describing the resource you have, Same sorts of things we talked about earlier. The format of that is usually very specific to that particular software. Now, it may use another metadata standard. It might even use MARC. If it uses MARC, it's going to have much more consistency and compatibility with what we do in our ILSs. There's not many of those repository systems that have the ability to work with MARC. They're almost always something like Dublin Core or MODS, which is another schema. But we do the same kind of work. It's just in a different format. So I did say we were going to talk more about copy cataloging versus original cataloging. So when you're copy cataloging, you're going to find an existing record. So this is a record that someone else has already created. Another cataloger did the original cataloging and they have created a record, and you are looking for a matching record. So you are going to review that record to make sure it matches. And we will touch on this at the end of today about what makes for a match. So you may be, depending upon what you're looking at, you may be reviewing more or you may be reviewing less. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that when we get to that part. If you're a Dewey library, then you're typically going to add your Dewey call number following your local standards for Dewey call numbers. So however you construct a Dewey call number, that's going to be part of your process. You can edit these records locally. So locally means in your own ILS. So you get a record from the Library of Congress, you get a record from OCLC, you get a record from your vendor. It's going into your ILS. Original cataloging, on the other hand, is when you are creating a record completely from scratch. You have, there is no matching record. So if you're a person who is creating original records, maybe you do a little both. You do copy cataloging and then you create records when you need to. In the process of doing cataloging, you always are looking for an existing record first. So you go, you search in your resource, you see if you can find an existing record that matches. If you do, you use it and copy cataloging. In original cataloging, if you find a record that is not a match, but has elements of it that you can reuse, then you can actually copy that record to start as a template for your original cataloging. You can't just use it as it is and edit it because it's not the same thing as what you have. But if it has enough common aspects to it, then you can at least copy it over and then kind of use that as a basis for records. Original cataloging involves not only that recording or documenting of the resource itself, but then it also includes that analysis with these subjects and classification. So it's a much more intensive process. Depending upon a particular library, if you're doing original cataloging, you may also be submitting names to the National Authority file. So it can be a very complex process to do this. Now, if you do not have the ability to create an original an original record or a new record in OCLC, which is one place that we share records. Sky River is another place that shares records, but if you do not have the ability to add new records to that, then you may just be doing all of this work within your ILS. So you don't have to, you can do anything locally following your policies. So OCLC, I mentioned this already. OCLC has very specific rules about when a new record must be created. And I'll make sure that that link is in the documentation, but I'm sure it is. OCLC stands for Online Computer Library Center. And you may think like, wow, that sounds like a name that was come up with a long time ago. You would be right. OCLC has been around for a long time, at least since the 70s. It's been a lot of things, but it sort of started out as more of a co-op where libraries could share data and share records. And it kind of is more of a non-profit-ish thing now. just sort of a short, brief overview, and we'll dive more into this next time, but in a short, brief overview, changes in format, additions, language, significant changes in the way the resource is published, and title changes and serials all require a new record. So this is kind of a, this can be kind of one of those things that gets a little bit tricky with copy cataloging when you find something that almost matches but doesn't. If you belong to OCLC, it's not free. You do have to join. At times, they've done various credit kinds of programs. So if you add a lot of original records, if you add a lot of new records, they would give you more credits, sort of credits back towards your membership. But OCLC is the place, or is one of the places where we share records and where people can get records from. So copy catalogers can down records for use in their own ILS. Original catalogers can add records. Of course, original catalogers can download records too, but typically they're going to be copy cataloging or adding original records. OCLC also has some batch record editing processes where some of these large consortia just like batch upload records. It is a shared database. It's not free. It's also the back end to ILL functionality. So if you participate in OCLC World Share and you participate in sharing an ILL through OCLC, the back end of that is the OCLC platform for cataloging. So the data is coming from those records. Now, there is a profile. So if you do ILL, there is a profile that can be set. So you can say like, we're not going to loan any serials. So anything that your library owns or has holdings for in OCLC, if it's a serial, then those requests would not come to you. So they'd just be kind of denied. But ILL is sort of the, I would say, partnership in terms of the records that we're using within OCLC. So as part of it, if you are downloading records in OCLC, you're probably also setting holdings in OCLC. So if you're saying to OCLC, yes, my library owns this particular title. And we're going to go through much more of that and talk much more about that in the next session. So we hopefully have a basic understanding of the purpose of our work. So we're going to talk briefly about terminology that you're going to hear or see. So we've talked briefly about creating or collecting, that copy cataloging aspect, to describe the resources that we own or hold. We've talked about records being added to a database. We talked a little bit about the record format being MARC. We're going to get to that more in just a minute. And we've talked a little tiny bit about how our practices are evolving to meet modern needs, especially with digital content. But we're really going to talk about that right now. So I call this putting the fun in fervor. So the first thing I would challenge you to think about, because there are actually 3 conceptual data models that were developed in the late 1990s, and hang with me because I promise we're not going to get too theoretical here. But these were developed in the 1990s to start the process of revising our cataloging rules. Because what was happening in the 1990s? This was the beginning of the rise of digital content. So late 1990s, early 2000s, we saw a huge shift as the internet came online. We saw the rise of, well, what we know of in the world, right? Hey, what we're doing today, right? We are so connected and so many of our resources are digital now. So our rules that we had in place for how we do the work that we do had been kicking around since, like the late 60s. They had been revised a few times, last revised in 2009. But even before that revision, there was an understanding that this content was coming our way. We were seeing more electronic content. We were seeing more formats, all kinds of changes afoot, right? You think about that time period from the late 1990s, and even if you weren't a cataloger then, even if you're a kid then, you probably were at least aware of like, oh, suddenly there's MP3s, or maybe you're not aware of that. You just got MP3s. It was a huge shift in terms of, really worldwide, right? The shift to digital. And the shift to digital started impacting us because what happens? Patrons start wanting digital. We start getting sent digital, right? We subscribe to a journal. Suddenly we're getting we're no longer going to print it because it's all that paper is too expensive. That mailing's too expensive. Here's the digital format for it. So we started receiving digital, getting it, regardless if we wanted it or not. Patrons start asking for it. We started wanting to collect it. All those things together. And our rules were not at all remotely designed to deal with that. I mean, we kept trying to make them work. Like, we'll just keep tacking on, we'll keep adding on to the house. We'll just keep adding a new room. And, we were getting a really hodgepodge looking house there. It was not going to be sustainable or successful in the long run. So we really needed to look at this rise in digital content because it was not going anywhere. In fact, it was getting more, not less. And so one of the things we really wanted to do was to, step back a minute. And this is where we got our user task list. What is cataloging? Why are we doing it? And where are we going with cataloging? What's the purpose of the work we do? Where do we need to be situating ourselves in the future? We didn't really foresee social media though, and we did not foresee the rise of mobile. I know some of us probably wish we had so we could make a little money. We did not see that at all. But we did start at least talking about digital content, talking about the changes that this internet thing, and this is before me too in terms of cataloging, but starting to talk about what this internet thing meant for cataloging and for data. At this time, there were many libraries that still had card catalogs, so they still had that print paper card catalog. Those beautiful wooden cabinets that I've been trying to get one for a while. But that was what library data looked like. It was data on a card. That information on the card was really what we had up until at least the late 70s, early 80s in most libraries. Now, Library of Congress started making electronic records in the late 1960s. Some large libraries started that process in the late 70s, early 80s. Many libraries were still card catalogs up until around the late 1990s. So I know it seems like, electronic records and electronic data and the internet's always been here and all that kind of stuff. But, when you're talking about 30 or 40 years of change in libraries and how that shift to automation changed things. And then also this rise of digital content changes things. We had a lot of change factors going on with technical services at that time period. And we still are in that process. So we have moved forward in a lot of ways, but we still have some things we're still working out. So one of the things that we looked at was, what do we want this data that we're creating, which had been on cards, and all we did when we moved from cards to electronic was, how can we take this card and make it into an electronic record? And if you actually look at the format, I have card catalogs at my desk here, I could pull one, but if you look at the format of a card catalog and you look at the format of a MARC record, it is almost, you can just see it. It is so close in terms of how those things are formatted. It's really amazing. So we just took those print cards and we just said, where can we take the title information and where are we going to put it into an electronic record? Where are we going to put the author information into an electronic record? Where are we going to put the subjects? All that information from a card catalog, we just took it and plopped it into a record. Now, the MARC record choice, that came around the 1960s too. So that's kind of, and it was developed to deal with our data. So that's kind of how we ended up with MARC. But during this time in the late 1990s, all this change is afoot. We need to do something. And so we wanted to take a look at our bibliographic records. So this is the descriptive records that we have been creating, those MARC records we've been creating for the libraries that were MARC at that point. We wanted to look at them and really kind of critique them and think about what do they need as a record, as data? What do they need to be functional? What do we want the purpose of this data to be? What is this data's function? So that's all functional requirements for bibliographic records is. I know it's a big, long phrase, but it tells you exactly what it means. What is the functional requirements? What are our requirements for functionality of this data that we are creating? That's it. It's got a, like I said, it's got a big fancy title and it's a very, very simple meaning. But in the process of doing this, and we're not going to dig too much into this, like I said, I just want to kind of give you the terminology so you'll have it when you see it. We started thinking about, is there a better way? And how can we work with this data? How can we work with this MARC data that was developed in the 1960s? How can we work with this and push forward towards more modern systems? And of course, this conversation continues. We are continuing to figure out how can we get out of MARC into something that's more modern so we can do some of these things we have in mind. And one of the ideas that came about, which I think is fantastic, is that any common data between records could inherit downward. So if you have different printings and versions of Dracula, they're going to have all the same subjects, right? Now, if it's a parody, it's going to be different. But, you know, if you have, you know, Dracula, the Francis Ford Coppola Dracula, and you have Dracula with whatever the first one was, in the Boris Karloff, wasn't he Dracula in the 1920s or 30s or whatever? Anyway, you have all these different Dracula movies and you have all these different Dracula books, but the subject's going to be the same, right? It's going to be, you know, vampires and horror and you know, all of that kind of stuff. So if we could figure out a way that all that data that should be consistent across all the different versions and editions and translations and all that stuff, if we could find a way that we could share all that data across them, then certainly for copy cataloging, it would be a huge win, because we wouldn't even really have to think about those subjects. Like, are they right? Are they wrong? Or maybe I don't look at them anyway, because I'm just going to kind of take this record because it matches and I'm not looking at those subjects. But then I might be loading a record or saving a record into my catalog. And, you know, maybe somebody put the wrong subject heading in Dracula. They put in wizards. And so, you know, someone's not going to find that particular one if they're looking for, you know, vampires and horror stories, because you've got wizards and fantasy novels or whatever it may be in there. So, you know, that's one of the things that would be wonderful if we had the ability to kind of share common elements of data for a particular title across all the different versions and editions. And this is the idea behind WIMI, which is work, expression, manifestation, and item. That is a hierarchy of data. So it would be breaking a bibliographic MARC record up into 3 or 4, because the item piece, the item part of it gets a little bit kind of squiggly, because that's more of like a barcode record. And we typically create the barcode record below in our hierarchy. But the idea is that the work, expression, manifestation piece of it would be all of that information about our resource. And then we would have the actual item that we're barcoding. This is a wonderful idea, right? I mean, truly, it's a great idea. And our public interfaces often show this. So sometimes you'll be searching for a title and you'll see that there'll be a movie icon and maybe a DVD icon, and maybe there'll be a book icon. And it's like, oh, look at all the different versions of that particular title. And when you are in a public display and you see that kind of thing, where you're seeing all those little icons for different versions, that is this presentation that we're looking at. So it's just kind of pulling together everything into this master record. Unfortunately, in our data displays, we do not really have the ability to build this structure. But you will see this terminology when you are looking at documentation sometimes. So you'll see the terminology of a work, and work is going to be that sort of upper level record where things would be consistent across all the different formats and versions. Expression is where translations would fall. Manifestation, I did not pick these terminologies, by the way. I have an issue with manifestation. Manifestation is the actual resource we have. So this is I think of it as the thing on our desk. It could be the thing on our virtual desk. It could be the thing on our physical desk. This is the thing we're describing and cataloging. How many pages is it? All of that kind of stuff. And then item is the volume we're going to barcode ourselves. So this WMI model, although it sounds very complex, it's a fantastic idea. And we do see it in some of these public interfaces now, not all of them. Unfortunately, we do not have the ability to really catalog under this model, but we're starting to see this terminology change in some of our documentation. So if you go in and you look in the RDA toolkit, which is the best practices for using RDA, which we're going to talk about in just a second, you're going to see this terminology kind of baked in. And it can be a lot because it's really talking about the data in different ways. So I wanted to kind of give you a little cheat sheet and just kind of talk through that. And that's all we're going to talk about that. It's a great idea. What we are cataloging when we are cataloging a MARC bibliographic record, it's collapsing all of this. We have just one record for everything, as we've always had. Now, we might have different pieces of the hierarchy, and we're going to look at that in just a second, but in terms of bibliographic record, it's just collapsed into one. Same as it's always been. When you look at OCLC, you're looking at a bibliographic record. There's no item because there's no thing to barcode. Item would be at the local library level, but it's the work expression manifestation piece of it. So same as it's always been. So this idea that's in Ferber is a fantastic idea, and we're seeing it in the public interfaces, but not in our data, which is unfortunate. And how you sometimes see this is when you see things like view all formats and editions, or maybe you will see a title up here and then it will kind of list all the different, icons for the different versions and things like that. So I mentioned RDA already. So RDA, and I've already kind of alluded to this already. So RDA stands for Resource Description Access, and it's a revision of our cataloging rules from, say, the 70s and 80s and early 90s. It was originally published in 2000. It was considered to be implemented in 2013, but do not panic. That doesn't really mean much. It just means that OCLC and the larger libraries consider themselves to have implemented it. That's all you need to know about it. It is, as it's written, agnostic of MARC, meaning that you do not need to use MARC in order to use the guidelines or best practices for describing resources, for cataloging. Now, most of us are still using MARC. If you're working in an institutional repository, scholarly communication database, digital archive, any of those kinds of things, you could use the RDA guidelines and use your own metadata standard with them. You can do that because it is not, although there are a lot of examples in RDA that still use MARC, it is not a MARC specific thing. So we have separated out our best practices from the format, which is fantastic because that gets us ready then to get rid of MARC at some point. So we're separating out the content of the record, what goes in the record, from the data structure. Now, we're still in MARC, most of us. So what we do is so much still framed by MARC. But for those of you not working in MARC, you can certainly use it with other resources. So we did have 3 models. And I didn't talk too much about the other 2 models, but they are the same sort of thing. One was for bibliographic data, which is what we've been talking about. The other was for authority data, which would be your names and subjects. Actually, names and subjects were split into two. So there was one for subjects and one for names. So that's your three models. It was bibliographic data as a whole, names, and then subjects. They were developed by 3 different committees, developed at different time periods, and they were meant to fit together, but they didn't really. They also were before really the rise of social media and mobile and all this other kind of stuff. So in 2017, we decided to collapse all the 3 models into one. And this is called the Library Reference Model, or the LRM. So for those of you who've learned the Ferber stuff, most of it stays the same. It's just kind of squished into one model. There's some changes in terminology, but it'll be easy for you to get up to speed. For those of you who are new, who've never learned the Ferber 3 models, yay, you only have one to think about. The things we've talked about so far, the user task, the WIMI model, those all stay the same. So nothing we've talked about is changing under this particular model. It's more changes to name authorities and subjects. So RDA is our practice. That is our best practices for how we describe records, for how we catalog. And then we have our local practices. So it may be what you do in your library, your consortium, your system. You may have other requirements that you're adding. LRM is our conceptual data model. So that includes that WIMI model we just talked about, that is such an aspirational data model. That would be fantastic if we could ever get there. It's also the way that we're thinking about developing our systems and working with our vendors to talk about system development at a conceptual modeling stage. And the terminology, it does have some terminology that changes in our documentation. MARC is still our format. Now, this will not be true forever, but it is still our format. So back to the practical. I tried to keep that as light as I could. Back to the practical. So our data is used by our library related systems, our ILS. These are often baked into our websites. And sometimes we kind of squish together databases and library resources. So for example, we have here virtual reality, the book, and then we also have a database. So the virtual reality, the book, that's coming from the library catalog part of it's coming from the MARC data part of it. And then this database is coming from, well, from some other system, some other database. So our data is the information for the systems, including our ILS. Bibliographic record, bibliographic, what does bibliographic mean? It means of writing. So literally a bibliographic record is a record of writing, or a record of the data. It contains the data elements necessary. I love Wikipedia's. I kind of collapsed it a little bit, but I love Wikipedia's definition here because it's exactly spot on. I could have written this. Data elements necessary to help users identify and retrieve that resource. Wait, what is that? Ferber user task, right? Can our users find what they're looking for? Can they identify it and then go get it? Can they find that resource? Supporting information, there's our contextual information that we put into our records to kind of help people a little bit more, presented in a formalized bibliographic format. That would be what right now? That's going to be MARC, right? That's where we are. We're here with the MARC. So when we look in our ILSs, and every ILS handles this a little bit differently, some library systems will have a 3-part record. So remember the WIMI model is just for the bibliographic piece of it. So that would be like the bibliographic MARC record. But then some library systems will have a holdings and an item record too. And we're going to look at that. So if we look at, and I would say one of the things that I would encourage you to do is spend some time looking in your own ILS and maybe pick a couple of other ILSs to look at. You know, go into the Library of Congress catalog and take a look. And what you're going to be looking for is you're just going to be kind of taking a look at all of these different, these are little labels here, these little labels like main author, format, you know, published, that kind of stuff. And then what I would suggest you do is kind of take a look at that, and you'll have a MARC cheat sheet that you can use to do this with, and then see if you can identify the MARC fields that might be used. And then if it has, so you will want to choose one that says technical view or technical display or MARC record, or it may say details or more information, but you're going to want to be able to get to that MARC view of the record so you can then check your work. So, just take this and kind of figure out like, okay, where would language be coming from? If I look at my list, where would language come from? If I look at addition, where would addition come from? And as I mentioned, many ILSs will kind of divide up the information. So we have up here the bibliographic information. This is that MARC information. And then we have down here all this information about like call number and stuff like that. Now you may say, well, isn't call number in a bibliographic record? And it is. But call number is also sometimes an additional holding or location record. And so here's an example of just kind of exactly what I was saying. I took the little display and then, okay, where would the title come from? Where would that title, what field would that title be in? Where would the, language go? Where would the publisher information go? And just kind of, checking yourself to kind of get a sense. Now, there's also bibliographics format and standards, and that is a wonderful tool because it goes way beyond my cheat sheet, but it will give you a little bit more information. So when you're looking in an OPAC, this is sort of what you'll see. They're all a little bit different, but this is an example of what you might see when you're looking at a MARC record. And in this particular situation, so over here, we're seeing a more public user-friendly view. And we've also, there's that holdings information over there that has like the location and things like that. Technical display, that's the MARC display. And then they sort of broken the data up a little bit. So they put the description here, table of contents, things like that. We look at the technical display, then this is more what we're going to see. We're going to see something that looks very MARC-like. It's going to have a bunch of tags. And then it's going to have this stuff up here at the top, which is called the fixed field. And we'll talk a little bit more about the fixed field as we're talking about MARC stuff here. The reason why the fixed field is called the fixed field is because there are only specific values that can go into each one of these positions. So it's very specific in terms of the choices that are made. MARC is a 3-digit tag. So you'll see here 005, 008, 010, 020, all the way down. It starts at 000 and it ends at 999. Within each of these MARC fields, there are what's called indicators, and these are the 2 positions, because MARC is a really old language from the 1960s, so each position is actually accounted for. So there are, if you look here at the 050, there are 2 zeros here. These are defined in the MARC manual. And I know from looking at this that the 050 and second indicator, so first indicator 0, second indicator 0. So those are positions. I know that second indicator 0 means this is a record that was created by the Library of Congress and was assigned by the Library of Congress. Now you may say, well, how do I know what that 0 would be? Well, for one thing, if I were working in OCLC and I did not have the correct authority, it's probably not going to let me use that second indicator 0. Also, I can look up in bibliographics format and standards, and it will tell me what that 0 means. So anytime you are looking at a MARC record, and really the only way to kind of learn MARC records and work with MARC records is just to learn and work with them. But one of the, I think, kind of fun things to do with MARC records is, like I said, look at that public display and then go look at that technical or MARC view to see if you can kind of see, did you kind of get it right? And you don't have to do all the MARC fields. You can just do the ones that are the most common or the ones that you might be using when you're doing your work. So indicators, 3 digits, and it starts with 000 and it goes to 999. Each one of these is a range. So 100 to 199. That's all related to authors and creators. 200 to 299. Now, not all of those numbers within that particular range are used. They are defined in the MARC manual, which does appear in Bibliographics Format and Standards. 200 to 299 is defined for specific things. So each one of them are defined. So indicators are the two following characters, and they affect a lot of different things that the computer does. So one of the things we do within MARC formatting when we create a MARC record is we actually include instructions. You may not know you've been doing this. We include instructions to the computer. So for example, for the 245, this first indicator 1 is only defined as 1 if a 100 field exists above it, or 110 or 111. It has to be one of the, and there has to be a 1XX field up there. So something in the 100 range. If there is no 100 field here, so if there were no author, or might be like edited by a group or something, no 100 field here, this would be 245.0. How do I know that? Because the MARC manual tells me so. MARC is defined to this level. And the reason why we're telling the computer this relationship has to do with how it would display to the public. Now, modern systems are much smarter than we've given them credit for. And so because of that, some of these instructions that are baked into MARC, we still do them because they're MARC requirements, but our systems no longer need us to do this. So for example, this 245.4, so this second indicator of 4, this tells the system where to start indexing the title. If someone is searching for the title, are they searching for the broker? Probably not. Who would search for the broker? We're going to search for broker, right? You're going to search for the first major word. So in searching and indexing, we want to tell the system the title doesn't start with the, although it does, but in terms of searching, we want to start searching for broker. Now, if somebody types in the broker, they're still going to find this. They type in broker, they're still going to find this. If we had a 0 here, we would say start the title right here, started at the first position, started at the. That means a user in the olden days especially would have had to type in the whole phrase, the broker, in order to find this book by title. So some of the things that are in MARC are a little bit of a holdover because our systems are newer and can make some adjustments. However, most of our newer systems have been built to work with MARC. So if the expectation is you are going to code this second indicator correctly for the spaces that it would need to go before it gets to the first real world word, so not an article, then if you don't code this correctly, your system may still not show this in a title search unless you do the. Because even though the system's smarter, it is dealing with an older coding language and it's expecting that. So for one, I can kind of even memorize that if I have an English language book and it starts with the, it's always going to be 4. And why is it going to be 4? Because I'm going to the position of the first real word. The 1, H2, E3, space 4. First real word starts at B. So I want it to skip the first 4 positions. So that's where the 4 is coming from. So again, this is one of those things where we're giving instructions within the work that we're doing. Now, is this how modern programming languages work? Not really, not in terms of descriptive data that we create, but it's how MARC works. The other thing that you'll see is there's these little, and in this case, it looks like a pipe. It's a straight line. This is called a delimiter, and this is the designator at the beginning of the field. And these also can look like a little double, this is called a double dagger. It kind of looks like a double plus sign. So you may see it like that. You may see a pipe, which is this long stick, or you may see a dollar sign. All of those are completely acceptable, and you're going to use whatever format your system is requiring. If you're trying to import records into your system and you're having some issue, I would suggest taking a look at two things, taking a look at your encoding. What kind of encoding is your system using? OCLC is typically Unicode. And that has to do with the formatting of the fonts and the diacritics and things like that. But you're just going to look to see what your encoding is on your side. Make sure it matches what's on the OCLC side. The other thing you might want to take a look at is whether or not your diacritic symbols are matching. So MARC stands for Machine Readable Cataloging. And yes, that sounds like something from the 1960s because it is from the 1960s. It is used for bibliographic records, which we've already talked about. It's also used for holding records, which we really won't talk too much about today. It is the basic building blocks of a system. It started out as a way to replace these lovely card catalogs into an electronic record. We've already talked through this example some, and I've given you a little diagram here so that you can kind of see things. The two things that I wanted to point out here, beyond the delimiters, so there's the delimiters and an example, is that in OCLC in many systems, the subfield A, so in all of these MARC fields, there are a couple of exceptions that do not start with a subfield A. Again, they're defined in the MARC manual. For those exceptions, it's 775, 264, subfield 4, or second indicator 4. There's a couple others that are the exceptions, again, defined in the MARC manual. For most fields, it is going to be a subfield A at the start of the content of the record, and that subfield A is hidden in OCLC. It's there, but it's just hidden. So again, if you're having problems with your records importing, or if you're working with some kind of batch processing, you may need to take a look to see whether or not your subfields are correctly. So within a MARC record, within a MARC field, so here's a MARC field 245. It is defined as being the title field. There's our first and second indicators. We've already talked about those. They are defined according to the MARC manual. And then here starts the content from our particular resource, calm energy. And then it had some other piece of title here, how people regulate mood with food and exercise. Now, if we decide if there's a comma in our title or the title somehow broken up in a way, then we would probably put the second part of that information in a subfield B. So we are dividing, so this was subfield A, we are dividing up the information into subcategories using these subfields. And then to complicate things just a little bit more, as if we need anything else, there's something that kind of hangs around called International Standard Bibliographic Description, or ISBD. And this is the punctuation that you see in records. So this is the colon, this is the slash, this is the period at the end of the field. It is not actually MARC, but it is part of MARC in terms of how we use it. There has been talk about whether or not we want to continue doing punctuation. There are some institutions testing not using punctuation. So if you are copy cataloging and you are using records from OCLC and you see records that do not have punctuation, if that record matches, it's okay to use. You may need or want to add that punctuation back. Your system may do funky things if you don't put the punctuation in, or it just may be something that you personally cannot live with. And that's okay too. So common MARC fields. Again, I can't stress enough, look up MARC fields and bibliographic formats and standards. You can actually, if you see a MARC field and you're like, I don't know what that MARC field is, you can put the number into bibliographic formats and standards and it'll bring it right up and you can know more about that particular field than you'd probably ever want to know. I've given you a very brief list here. This is kind of my brief list here. And I've kind of noted to you where that's transcription. So transcription means that it's coming directly from the resource. You record it as it appears on the resource. We'll talk much more about transcription in part 2 because this really impacts copy catalogers, because there are some choices that original catalogers can make with transcription. Transcription means, in theory, it should match what you see. If you are looking at a record and the title varies, then that's a question. How much does it vary? Is there a note? Title from spine or title from book jacket. If you have a note like that in your record and what you see does not match 100%, but it's close, pretty close, almost the same, and everything else matches. So everything else about the record matches, but the 245 is somehow a little off, and you see a note that says title from book jacket, and you don't have the book jacket, then I would say if everything else matches, that would be something you could consider as a match. You would want to proceed cautiously and truly scrutinize that record to make sure you have a match. But if so, you could go forward. So also talk a little bit about what fields I think are the important fields in terms of matching, but the 245 is a transcription field, and that's obviously a place you're going to be looking for a match. 264 is the publication field. There's a little bit of variety there, but the dates and the publishing information should match somewhere on your piece. 300 field, that is the physical description. You should have the same kind of format, and it should be the same. Now, if it's off a page or two, then you, again, anytime you have a variation in a record that looks like a match, you're going to want to carefully scrutinize it, because it may be that they're counting a page that's blank. Sometimes things like tissue, especially for older materials, a sheet of tissue will get put before a portrait or plate. Sometimes people count those pages of tissue. I never do, because it's just meant to protect the image. But you know, if it were off a page and everything else matched, I would use that record. But everything else has to match. The more things you have that do not match, even if they're little tiny variations, those start adding up, and they'll start weighting you to the you don't have a match. So it is very important that once you go through and you look for things, that you're making sure that things match. And we'll talk much more about this. Again, here's my little taking an OPAC record and kind of looking to see where I'm looking at MARC fields. We've already talked through kind of how to do this and do it as a little exercise. And then also we've talked through, you know, some of the ways that MARC works with indexing searching. We've already talked about the 245, but I put it in writing here. You will see in bibliographic formats and in the MARC manual, you will see NR and you will see R. NR means not repeatable. That means you may not have another one of those fields. You notice here I say 245 is not repeatable. That's not me saying that. That's the MARC manual saying that. So you can't put in two 245s. You can do the subfield B if you have a title that's separated on the page. We're going to talk more about titles in just a second. If you have a title that's separated on the page, you could do the subfield B. It may be that you have, there's other fields you can use too for other alternate forms of the title. We already talked about the 0 and the 1, the relationship with those indicators to that 100 above it. And we talked about those, what we call non-filing characters. Now, what do you think non-filing means? It has to do with card catalogs. So that's what non-filing means. So we still can't get past cards. This is what bibliographic formats and standards looks like. It is an OCLC product. The wonderful thing is there's a search, so you can search for any of these, and then I'll tell you what the name of that field is. It'll tell you if that's used in a bibliographic record or used in a holding record. It's going to tell you if it's required. So this is mandatory if you are creating a record in OCLC. And then it's going to tell you all the different pieces of it. And there's the NR for it is not repeatable. So you cannot have more than one of those. You can repeat some of the subfields, but it will tell you whether or not you can repeat a subfield. So it is that granular. So there are things you can do. If you're an OCLC, you can right click and that will allow you to look up MARC fields and you can take more of a look at it. You can use that bibliographic formats and standards that I talked about. If your ILS has the ability to look up fields, you can do that. We already talked about MARC being a range. We talked about indicators and we talked about subfields. Almost everything about MARC is defined down to the most granular thing imaginable. I gave you an ISBD punctuation cheat sheet. All those pieces in red are the places where you would see that ISBD. So for example, the addition information, there's a period at the end of it. The place of publication, publisher name, that's how that piece of it's punctuated. And also, this is also in the resources handouts too. So different types of materials use different MARC coding, and we also describe them differently. We kind of mix up or squish together format. We kind of think of format as the nature of the resource. It's a book, it's a manuscript, etc., and its actual physical or electronic format. But format, sort of the nature of the resource, is actually the type, and then of course format's the format. So we're going to talk through both of these as we kind of finish up here, and we're going to talk a little bit about what they are and kind of how they look at things. In olden days, and you can see this when you're actually looking at this, if you go up to the fixed field and you start looking at types of materials, you kind of see our legacy here. So our legacy was books. I mean, that's an easy one, right? We had lots of books, and then continuing resources, and that's all the things like serials, mostly serials, and websites now, but we didn't have websites back then. And then we kind of squished in a bunch of stuff under what I would call non-book or AV cataloging. This is also where maps went. This is where music went. This is where visual arts material like artwork goes, things like that. So some of even the presentation of information in a MARC record in terms of our choices that we make are really driven by these legacy workflows, I think. So a book, we call that a monograph, mono, single, writing, graph, a single work, single resource. Now they can have multiple parts to them, but it's meant to be a unique, finite work. So it has a planned end. If you are getting, volumes in a multi-volume set, so multi-part set, there is a planned end for that. So if you're trying to decide, this is where we get to that kind of squishy area. If you're trying to decide, you're looking at records in OCLC, or you're trying to decide what kind of thing it is, it's pretty easy to kind of see like, well, I have a book-like thing, right? It has pages and all of those kind of things. But then once you start getting things with numbering, as I call them, or things that are more than one, then things get a little bit more complicated. And again, we're going to dive much more into them next time. But a monograph is a title that is published as a finite work, be it an individual single volume or parts of a larger title. For books, we take the information from the title page, if one exists. The title page verso is the back of the title page. That's where we are taking our information from the title page itself and the back of it. There is actually a defined list in RDA guidelines that tells you where to look for, and I've put them here, where to look for things. If you are original cataloging and you do not have a title page, or maybe you need to use the book jacket or the cover or something else that is not the title page for your title, please include a 500 note to explain that your title came from the book jacket. Because for a copy cataloger or me, as I'm looking at that record, it would be very helpful for me to know that the title came from the book jacket, and I don't have the book jacket, but everything else matches about that. So I'm going to say I can use that record. You can also add, there's a 246. You remember I mentioned there were other places you could account for differences of titles. If you have more than one title, if you have you can add a 246 for another title as well. So if you are copy cataloging, if you're looking at a record and trying to make that decision, certainly you're going to look to see whether or not your title matches, your 245 matches the resource you have on the title page. You're also going to look at any notes that might help you make that decision. And if there's a 246, if it matches your resource, you can use that too. CIP is a little bit of an interesting situation. I can't talk too much about CIP, although I've done CIP. CIP is created, is cataloging in publication. So that means that the cataloging work, the description work, is done prior to that book being published. This is particularly tricky when we get to children's materials. For whatever reason, I do not understand, for whatever reason, children's materials, publishers of children's materials will sometimes submit the illustrator as the author and all sorts of things. So if you are copy cataloging and you see a 300 field that looks like this, pages CM, and that's it. And then maybe you see some other weird stuff. You know, maybe the author's not really the author. Maybe the author's really the illustrator. Then you have a CIP record that has not been finished. So at the time the person's cataloging, they're cataloging from the publisher's information. And so they do not fully know how many pages it's going to be, because how would they? It's not been printed yet. They don't know what size it's going to be, because again, it's not been printed yet. They don't know that the author may decide that they're going to change it from 99 activities to 99 activities. It's based entirely upon what the publisher has provided them. So if you are copy cataloging and you encounter these types of records, which if you're cataloging a lot of new material that's hot off the presses, you may be encountering many more of these. Just know that you can edit these records with more confidence, because we know from CIP, and I certainly know from having my own experience with CIP, that you're going to have to fill in the 300 field, and you may have some other changes that you need to do, especially for children's materials. So you can edit. This is the one exception to it needs to match exactly, because there may be a chance that it does not match exactly. And you're going to have to kind of weigh, if you see a 300 that looks like this with no information in it, just sort of that default, that's just the default that goes in there, then that's going to be a decision for you to make in terms of, well, it matches good enough. So I'm going to edit this record because it is a CIP record. Now, if you have the ability to enhance or update that record in OCLC, certainly you should take the time to go ahead and do that. If you don't, you're copy cataloging, you need to use this record in your own system, download it to your own system, make the changes you need to make, and move on. But this is the one exception to you can, it has to match exactly. On the other hand, sometimes when you look at CIP and you look at the back of the title page, you'll see things like a Library of Congress call number, or you'll see subject headings, or you'll see a Dewey number. Do not think that what's printed here is accurate. Now, it may be, and in theory, it would be. But again, that cataloging information is based upon what the publisher has sent to that cataloger before that material was even published. So it could be right, or it could need some changes. And that's not only the changes in the record here, because what happens is once the cataloger is finished with this record, and this is considered finished, once the cataloger is finished with this record, this data gets sent back to the publisher and it gets printed in here. So you may, as a Dewey library, you may think, well, that's not at all where I would assign or classify that particular work. It's not a mistake if it's typically not going to be a mistake if it's in a CIP record. It's just something that needs to be updated. So that's a little bit different, because I think sometimes we see the CIP record when it's printed on this one does not have the full CIP record printed. It just says that a record has been requested. But if the record had come back to the publisher before this had actually gone to publication, they would print that catalogger's information in that record or in that title page. And that may or may not be right. So I think sometimes we look at that CIP and we think, oh, somebody, it's a Library of Congress program, they're great cataloggers, and that's true, but they're cataloging upon information that is not complete and may be subject to change. We're not going to be able to go through all of the MARC examples. I have kind of highlighted some things for you to take a look at. This is an example of an ebook record. How do I know it's an ebook record? Well, if I look here at these 336, 337, and 338s, I have information that tells me that it's an online resource and it's a textual document. So in that way, I can kind of deduce that it is a ebook record. And then of course, I also have this very nice note here from this cataloger that it was from the cover page. Isn't that handy? If your title did not match exactly. Now you'll notice here that it also has kind of this weird capitalization in the 245. Remember, 245 is one of those transcription fields. So the rules are to transcribe it as it appears in the resource. However, I said there were some choices there. One of the choices is you can use your own style manual. And your system may take care of this anyway. It might just say like, no, that's not how we capitalize things. So, that's one of those things. It's not wrong. It's right according to our rules, but it may not be right according to your own local policies. So there's the difference between what's a mistake and what's a choice in terms of our own local policies. I gave you my giant type landscape, and we're going to talk much more through this next time. So we're not going to talk too much about it. This will be spoiler alert. We're going to talk about all these different materials in terms of much more detail next time. Audio visual material, I'm not going to talk too much about it, other than we do have some new MARC fields or newer MARC fields to better categorize media and other types of materials. Because you remember we were talking about how we needed to talk about digital content. I think this is probably one of the places where I see the most unhappiness from catalogers, but it makes sense. So you remember we were talking about the book, we are taking the title and the information from the resource itself. So that would be from the book, from the title page. What is a similar place in a DVD or a VHS or streaming media? Well, it's not the container, because that'd be more like the book jacket, right? And it's not the DVD box set, because that would be more like the box set for a set of books. So it's not that either. It is the title screen. And yes, I know this is painful. I do know this, having done this. It is the title screen and the credits. That's the two places that are considered to be the choices from where you take the title information and the other information you're recording about that resource. Now, of course, we still provide contextual information that, subjects and all that kind of stuff, which are not coming from the piece itself, but in terms of the title and those other transcription fields that's in that transcription list I gave you there, those are coming directly from the resource itself. Now, you may say, but I don't have a VHS player, or I don't have a Blu-ray player. They won't buy me one. Well, this may be a opportunity for you to say, I need a Blu-ray player. But the other thing is, I am okay. I'll have to admit, this is not 100% the right way, but I am okay with you cataloging from the container. However, the container is never the first choice for media. So if you use the container, as I've said right here, use that 500 note to explain your source of information. So I am completely giving you a pass on this, but you have got to use that 500 note, because if I come along and I'm cataloging, the first Star Wars movie, and you've added Star Wars: A New Hope, because that's how they've repackaged it, but the movie itself the DVD itself still says Star Wars on it. If I pop it into the DVD player because I'm going to, follow the rules and catalog it the way it should, then I'm going to be like, what? And I will have wasted a lot of time. So as a good, being a good steward and being a good colleague, if you catalog from the container, for all of us who are copy cataloging, add your note. And I say that for everybody. If you're doing something in your own system and you're using the container, go ahead and put that note in there for you or for somebody else. Because if that question comes up, or maybe that container gets lost and you have to repackage it, you've lost that one representation of your title. So you can use anything about media to create that record, as long as you document in a 500 note where you're getting your information from, because that's going to be that documentation of, it's not on the resource, but here's where I got it. So we'll talk more about these newish MARC fields next time. These are a controlled vocabulary. So you just kind of pick off a list, and we're going to go through them as we go through individual resources. They are in my MARC cheat sheet. So we'll talk more about these next time. Again, I wanted to show you an example of someone who did a great job. Here's the Godzilla Showa era films from 1954 to 1975. It has 8 video discs, and it has an accompanying manual with it. Look at that nice subfilled E over there in that 300 field. And then you see we are taking the title from the container. And it may be in this case that, you have kind of various languages represented. So that may even have a hand in this too. And if we look up here at the top in the 041, we see that our language of cataloging is English, because this person's in the United States cataloging, but it is in English and Japanese. So it has multiple languages represented in this particular work. So this is and I've given you the OCLC number up here at the top. So if you are a media cataloger and you have access to OCLC, this is a really good example to go look at. Very, very good cataloging. Where I talked about that one, we'll skip through that one. We are going to talk much more about things with numbering in part 2. There's a lot of reasons why publishers do this. Sometimes it's for marketing promotion. Sometimes they want to organize resources they publish. We know authors write multiple works that they mean to group together. Maybe it's memoirs over the years. Maybe it's a particular series of books. Maybe they didn't think it was going to be a series to begin with, but they wrote the first one, and then lo and behold, now there's a second and a third and a fourth. We sometimes will group things together for our own use in the libraries too, in different ways. And again, we're going to really dive into that next time, but I did want to just kind of point out a couple of things in terms of things with numbering. So when you are looking at a resource, and this is going to be easier to see in a physical resource than it will be in a digital resource. Digital resource, you may be looking at a screen representation. Again, you're looking for things like this, changes in font sizes. That tells you something about what the publisher thinks is important. The location of the titles. Now, in this case, I have this big giant title up here at the top, land grant colleges, blah, blah, blah. And then I have this little title down here at the bottom, perspectives on the history of higher education. I would not add a subfill B to that big title with that little title down there, because I also have some volume numbering under that. I know it's hard to see. It's not a good scan of that book jacket, but I have that little bit of volume numbering there. So that would make me think that I have 2 things that are somehow related, but I don't really know what they are. So this would be one of those things that I would proceed with caution, because I have these 2 titles that do not seem to really have relationships to each other. I mean, it's not land grant colleges, blah, blah, blah. And then it continues on that title. So it's not a continuation of that title. It's kind of its own title, Perspectives on the History of Higher Education. And it has some volume numbering. So that would be a little heads up to me that I need to kind of take a look at this one a little bit more. Now, those of you who've worked with these kinds of materials a lot, you may look at this and go, I know what it is, and you probably do. But if your book has numbering, then you need to take a look at it, or it looks like it's part of something else. So one of the things I learned from an old time cataloger, which just astounded me the first time I encountered it, was especially for older materials, so like, turn of the century and, materials from the 1920s and 30s and things like that, especially for works of literature that are part of collections, sometimes they'll use things like stars on the spine. It's just, I would never have believed it if I hadn't seen it myself. And I wish I had an example to photocopy now, because it'd be great. But it'll be like 1 star for volume 1, 2 stars for volume 3, 3 stars for volume 3. So if you see things like stars or a particular pattern of, little icon kinds of things on the spine or the cover of a book, then especially if it's an older thing or it's a collection of works, you may just want to take a little closer look at that, because those kinds of little icons, especially for that publishing that sort of, like I said, literary works, and that seemed like around the turn of the century up till about the 1940s, that was more common than it was not. So if you're not dealing with older material, you may never see this. If you're not dealing with literature collections, you may never see this. But it is something to kind of be aware of. Other things to take a look at when you're looking at materials is words that indicate frequency, like annual and quarterly. And, if it's and by spring, I don't mean spring like water. I mean, fall, winter, spring kind of thing. Series, report, any of those kinds of words are going to be things to heads up that you may have something related. Is it part of something else? And I've given you sort of your choices here, but we're going to talk much more through these choices next time, because we're really going to actually get into all of these choices. And I'm going to give you some tools to help you make this decision. So we'll really dig into that piece of it next time. But I did want to just include this so that you'll have an idea of what you may be looking at when you see those kinds of words. Serials, that follows into things like newspapers, journals, things like that. They're issued over time and they have no end in place. Now, of course, we know magazines die and go away and all that kind of stuff, but they weren't meant to. And this is called treatment. So treatment is where you're looking at the material and the resources you have, and then essentially how you're going to treat it. Is it going to be a serial? Is it going to be a monograph? And what that will mean. So serials, we've touched on this just a little bit already. We can't dive too much in these, but they have parts with or without numbering. The most important part of it is they're not planned to end. Now, is our wonderful Teen Superstars magazine up here still being published? No. I mean, much to all of our dismay, I'm sure, still not being published. But at the time it was being published, it came out weekly, and it was, meant to continue on. Parts typically have the same title. Now, of course, up here we have Andy Gibb, the Bee Gees, and all these other things, but that wasn't actually part of the title. The title, which is hard to see, is Teen Superstars. They will have ISSNs. ISSN started in 1975, so older serials will only have ISSNs if they've gone back and retrospectively added them. I've given you a long list here of words related to serials. Now, this does not mean that it will always be true that these words will always be related to a serial, but they are commonly going to be related to serials. So other things you can see when you're looking at things, and I know we're getting right at time here, is if you're looking at a MARC bibliographic record, and here's another display of the leader, the fixed field information we talked about earlier. Each one of these fixed field pieces of it has its own little name, but you see there's a CAS. That S stands for serials. Monographs would be an M there. So that's one place. Another thing you can see is that subject headings, and I know you can't see the subject headings in this, but just rest assured, subject headings typically for a serial are one subject heading sometimes no subject headings, but usually 1, sometimes 2. Monographs will be often 3 to 10. Again, depending on the quality of record, sometimes there may be 0 in there as well, but serials typically will just have the 1 subject heading. Called numbers are often skeletal. So if you see here this RC531, there's no date in that call number. There's nothing that finishes out the call number. It's just sort of feels almost like a call number fragment. There's another indicator that you have a serial. Certainly, if you're searching in your public OPAC, you can just usually click serial for your format and you'll see serials that way. But in terms of looking at the MARC record, there are indicators to tell you you're looking at a serial record. And again, we're going to go through this much more as we talk about things with numbering, because of course serials often have numbering. Again, we talked a little bit about you could find information from the public side of it. You may see the ISSN, right there it is. You may see the ISSN, you may be able to see that volume numbering. Sometimes notes will tell you things too. And of course, you can often go look at the MARC display to kind of see things. As we wrap up here, we talked about subjects already. Really what I want to talk about subjects here is, since we've already talked about what the subject is and all that kind of stuff, is about the relationship of the subject heading and the call number. The first subject heading is considered to be the primary subject heading. It reflects the primary topic or focus of the work. And this generally, I would say 99% of the time, corresponds to the call number that is assigned. So if you are assigning a Dewey call number, you're going to look at that first subject heading. And you can look at the Dewey call number that's in the record, if there's one there, of course. If not, you're going to look at the subject heading and then figure out where it would fall for Dewey. LC, that's going to be the start of your call number if one does not exist. We'll talk more about LC next time. We'll talk more about Dewey next time. Now that we understand just a tiny bit about cataloging, as we wrap up here, what should match? So what should match? 245, your author information, dates of publication, and we're going to talk about those all in detail next time. Physical description and whether or not there's a series, as well as specific information about editions, languages, series, and format. And on that note, copy cataloging best practices, review all relevant information. I think we've talked through all of these already. This is kind of my checklist to make sure I've talked about everything that I want to talk to you about. Do not just take a record and fix it up to match what you have. You're going to have to weigh those differences, and are they considerable differences? And if they are, you're going to proceed with extreme caution. Different formats for the same title should be on different records. Language, format, different editions, including series or not in the series, different records. And of course, as always, I always say this to everybody, don't delete data unless without fully understanding your decisions, because it may impact your ILS. And on that note, thank you. And I'm going to turn on my video and see if there's any additional questions or things that we should chat about. And this is being recorded, and I will send the exercises. Oh gosh, I've got so many. Don't be overwhelmed. I do have lots of cheat sheets for you. The other thing I will say is, there are lots of good resources out there, and I have a resources handout for you too. So I know I've stressed bibliographic formats and standards a lot. That just is because I feel like it's one of my favorites, and it has all the MARC information you'd ever want to know. If you find that the MARC manual is a better presentation for you, or any library's MARC documentation or cataloging documentation, certainly use whatever resources is a good fit for you. And if you are a person that is managing and is working with other people, you may be kind of collecting your own resources. So that's a good process. Yes, you will get a copy of the PowerPoint. I don't read everything on there. Sometimes I throw things on there just because I was like, yeah, I want to put this in writing. So there's a little bit of that happens with my presentation. So next time we're going to talk much more about things with numbering. We're going to talk much more about troubleshooting, and we're going to talk much more about what do you do when a record does not match. Also, if you have any additional questions you would like me to cover for next time in terms of specific situations you encounter, please let Vicki know too. I'll be glad to try to squeeze them in.